States is competing with China across multiple dimensions, and we make no bones about that. But we are not looking for confrontation or conflict.
A clear strategy of implementation from the side of the United States, considering that
the idea before was that the US had such a superior power, much more than the other competitors or potential competitors.
Again, specifically on research and development, hardware and technology.
As we've said before, we are ready either way. We are ready to continue results-oriented diplomacy that addresses the security concerns of the United States.
Competitive edge in terms of economic and technological expansion. And that requires so many aspects of the strategy, whether you need to strengthen your own dimensions of power.
In a world where the balance of power is constantly shifting, understanding the strategies for engaging with major global powers has never been more crucial. The future of national security, and indeed global stability, hangs in the balance. A pivotal era in global strategy unfolds as the US reevaluates its stance towards China. Engagement evolves into strategic competition, aiming for American security without inciting conflict.
Definitely Professor Nye is correct in that assumption that with the decrease in US economic power, you got the decrease in the stature of the US as the supreme power managing world affairs. In that sense, managing China's increase needed to comply with the new changes in the power balance between the US and China and the other players at the international level. So the reduction in the financial abilities came with a reduction in the American economic ability, and that automatically will have its implications for military, diplomatic, and political in general. The idea before was that the US had such a superior power, much more than the other competitors or potential competitors, gave the US the leverage to decide for the rest of the world. With the reduction of that and with the simultaneous increase of Chinese power, definitely the failure of managing China started to take place.
This isn't a redux of Cold War. The duo of rivalry and cooperation addresses modern global issues. Jake Sullivan, US National Security Advisor, highlighted the US's readiness to tackle 21st century global challenges through competition, cooperation, and diplomacy. US strategy intertwines deterrence with leading through innovation and strengthening democratic principles. Recalibrating acts of cooperation and competition ensures US interests aren't compromised. The US fortifies alliances extending beyond bilateral engagement to secure a competitive edge.
Definitely, again, the international system must rotate around some poles. That's how we define it, theoretically at least, in international relations. Once the US lost its hegemonic status as the director, coordinator, as the world policeman, if you like, with the rise of a competitor, with the decrease in the US ability to maintain that hegemonic status, you had the opportunity for aspiring powers, let's call them the developing powers, to present an alternative. And for that purpose, to maintain the authority, to maintain management over the international system, the Americans will definitely need to keep their traditional allies. And here the focus would be on the Western world, specifically in terms of the ideological dimension of the organization of the globe. So automatically the assumption is that liberal capitalists in the West and their close friends, their supporters, would remain in the American-led alliance. Meanwhile, the Chinese will try to play the same game on the opposite side by finding some ideological partners at the same time who share with them the outlook on world organization and managing world affairs. This really would definitely put some pressure on the Europeans to remain on the American side, and automatically would allow the people or the countries who believe in the state capitalism or the command capitalism to cluster together anyway to be able to counterbalance the West in general, led by the US. So automatically you're going to see countries like Russia, like North Korea, like Iran, and the alliance with China versus the West in general, led by the US, which is a throwback to the bipolar system, except that you have more than one power aspiring to play the role. And that is pushing towards the multilateral system, whereby you have a number of major powers trying to be players at the table. And that would present negative friction, and that may generate so much wars, many wars all around the world, as we're witnessing today, whether in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe with Russia and Ukraine, and with the threat of war between the Koreas and between China and Taiwan as well.
I think one of the reasons deals specifically with the substantial rapid growth of China in the last 2 to 3 decades. Because when it comes specifically to certain sectors of the economy, in concrete technology and research and development, perhaps over the last 5 to 6 years, in comparison with the last 2 decades, the last 5 to 6 years have been quite critical for China to try to outrank not only the United States but many other countries on the Western Hemisphere. Again, specifically in research and development, hardware and technology. There are a few exceptions already in which among the rest of the industrialized nations, the United States keep an advantage. But that advantage has diminished rapidly over the last 5 to 10 years, maybe. So definitively on this new setting of international politics, it is not any more convenient for the United States to simply act motivated for any type of challenge against the full interest of China. As I mentioned before, the level of cooperation and codependency has increased dramatically in the last decades, and therefore it is much more reasonable not just to look after some sort of managed cooperation, like you call it, but I believe a huge extent of the strategy should rely on the capacity of the West to try to coordinate their efforts so that they have a better negotiating position vis-a-vis China in the future. And definitively on this field, the case of the United States is quite advantageous, because the United States has been able to be at the top of the international governance system over the last century. So it is not anymore the scenario that we witnessed over the last, after the end of the Second World War, on the one hand, but on the other hand, there are already cards to be played by the United States vis-a-vis China, and definitively active diplomacy and a much managed coordination of competition with China, with many of the trade partners or with many of the political partners of the United States, the best way to go.
Pottinger and Gallagher urge a firmer stance and strategic victory, prioritizing U.S. defense and diplomatic strength.
I think for some political actors it's fair to claim that maybe a more straightforward approach could be part of the equation. I don't think, however, that currently the United States and China are competing on the same categories. And this is something that perhaps not many people, both in the West as well as on the East, have realized. The level of technological development of China, the speed at which infrastructure has been built up, and the level of influence of China with new and very rapidly more stronger trade partners all over the planet have pretty much changed the original equation of the game. So it is reasonable for some people, politically speaking, to try to move forward in a field where a more straightforward strategy goes against, apparently in favor of the interests of the United States and against the interests of China. But it doesn't look to me that they are currently competing on the same categories. The world has changed over the last 15 to 20 years. Quite critical strategic sectors currently, to a certain extent, are dominated by China. Other critical strategic sectors are dominated by the United States, specifically the security landscape and a few other technologies. So it is not like they are competing on these sectors. Pretty much they simply have a position of monopolic power on these sectors, and they don't see each other on some of these sectors as competitors. Not even, for instance, in the military sector, where the United States already holds perhaps the most strong strategic position in the recent history. And definitely it doesn't look like China has an interest to try to overmatch the United States on that field. At least not in the open statements of the high-rank officials. And on the other hand, for instance, you can notice as well that when it comes to the number of trade partners all over the planet, the number of trade partners of China has increased dramatically and decreased for the side of the United States. So it doesn't really look like China is considering the United States currently, at least on this specific field, like a competitor. They are working on two different environments. They have specialized into different categories, and upon those differences, I think perhaps it is better to think now what will be the upcoming strategies and the upcoming steps to take. And of course, among the different efforts in order to move forward in that direction, they also have to make sure that they keep advantage over those sectors, because there are other competitors. And there are other competitors also vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis the United States, like India, for instance, or specifically in the aerospace industry or the arms technology like Russia, or perhaps when it comes to some sort of pressure diplomacy in European countries like Turkey, or even regions like Latin America. So the world has changed, and it is better for you to make sure you are able to know in which field you are playing, and not just consider that you can over-compete or over-challenge everyone in every field.
Okay, let me begin maybe by saying that ideologies are exclusive and they would like to spread to cover the whole globe. By definition, ideologies would like to be global. So liberalism would not like to share the word with some other ideology, and definitely state command ideology would not accept to be sharing the word with liberalism on the other side. So from this perspective, we need to maintain our view of the balance of power and the dynamics of that. As long as China was playing the game under the rules of the capitalist world, the capitalist world, the liberal world led by the US, all of them were really supportive of the rise of China. And they benefited enormously from that. They invested heavily and the returns were good enough. China, in the meantime, used that to bolster, to increase, to improve its development to the level that it has gained enormous power in the process. The end result, we're talking today about something like 25 billion trade deficit between the US and China alone each month. We're talking about somewhere close to 400 billion to $500 billion of transfer of wealth from the US to China. And this wealth, sooner or later, will be translated into economic power, and economic power is a core concept of power at large. We expect, traditionally, historically, economic power is a precondition for political power, and definitely to protect that, you will have to have the military power as well. And that's the stage China is in right now. And it has already announced its presence globally in terms of spy satellites, balloons, and the number of aircraft carriers they are building, and claiming a bigger sovereignty over the South China Sea, competing with the neighborhood, and definitely first item of priority would be to regain what they consider to be the Chinese territory and the Chinese people spread around them, and then play the international game as well in that process. So as soon as China would stop accepting the rules of the old system and start to impose its own rules in competition with the old system, you're going to have that process of increased competition, and the reaction of that would be to change the strategy of positive engagement with China, encouraging China, including China, to be very cautious with China, to prevent China from maintaining this competitive edge in terms of economic and technological expansion. And that requires so many aspects of the strategy, whether you need to strengthen your own dimensions of power, technological first, maybe infrastructure, all of these items that the US policymakers are highlighting as an essential need now to be able to compete with the futuristic outlook of China in the long term. And China is playing this game very well, so you expect the strategy to be, let's increase our resources of power and make sure China is denied the opportunity to keep increasing its resources. So that's what you're seeing taking place basically between the Americans and the Chinese, and the different calls within the US policymaking decision circle to really implement this strategy more effectively.
Though Professor Seth Schindler and others foresee a looming second Cold War based on the network concept, where power networks intersect and challenge the US-led order. Both sides maneuver in this new age of geopolitical rivalry, where networks define the power play. Washington and Beijing use power in one network to gain advantages over others, with no clear victory expected due to countries aligning with both. For Washington not to lose in this conflict, Schindler suggests developing a grand strategy for power networks on its own.
To start with, I believe the analogy does not really fit well within the contemporary geopolitical system. First, because when it was the period particularly of the Cold War, we were talking about, on the one hand, two radically different politico-economic systems, and the distinctions between, specifically in the realm of the economy, between China and the United States are not so much as the majority of people believe when it comes specifically with competition, innovation, development, and research and development, and many other factors. And second, it was quite clear that both territories back on the First Cold War were unchallenged territories of concentration of political and economic power. We are not really on the same direction in this moment. It looks to me that more first, the case of China is a case of control and perhaps in some technological fields, complete monopoly of technology, even vis-a-vis the United States. On the other hand, it requires the interaction and the flows of capital from the United States as well as to the United States in order to mutually coexist. Both countries they require to engage in mutual relations that can lead to mutual benefits. So I will jump again to the assumption that the idea of a network, and particularly some sort of active diplomacy attempts to try to build up a networks of interactions and interests from the West vis-a-vis China, is the best strategy. And definitively the idea of a full, complete isolation is not currently, in my opinion, on the equation, because the Cold War required full, complete isolation between the two territories. The world today has changed dramatically, and after the fall of the West, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, over the last 30 years, the levels of interconnectedness and interaction, cooperation, and codependency between the East and the West, instead of decreasing, have increased dramatically, and specifically the levels of codependency between the United States and China. I also wanted to mention that there is another sector, perhaps you can put this in the part of the conversation in which China has no interest in definitively overcoming or challenging the United States, which is in international economic governance. Because after the end of the Second World War and after the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions and the end of the convertibility system of the dollar reclaimed its role as the leading global currency for exchange. And doesn't look like China want to overcompete or over-challenge the United States on that field. It's not like in their own interests, so they are working on two different categories.
This strategic debate calls for introspection and wise counsel to chart the future course.